Welcome to the Check-In, a podcast by the Telos Group on the Telos channel. This is your host, David Cadabot, checking in from Washington, D.C. On today's episode, we're diving into a discussion about apartheid, perhaps one of the most contested terms when it comes to talking about Israel-Palestine. Many in our network ask, what does apartheid really mean? Is it a fair word to use in this context? And if so, why is there such a strong reaction to it? We believe the time is now to discuss, particularly after a momentous advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, which ruled in its non-binding decision that the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories is illegal under international law. In the Palestinian territories, what was supposed to be a temporary military occupation imposed on over 5 million Palestinians has now lasted more than 57 years. It is no longer temporary. While Israel and the Palestinian territories might be distinct on paper, the reality on the ground, as we will discuss, is that the whole area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea is organized under a system that advances and cements the dominance of one people at the cost of another. As we know, that kind of system doesn't make anyone safe, and it attacks the inherent dignity of the millions of Palestinians living across the region. The invitation, as always, is to listen, to understand, and hold what we offer in tension. We know this is a charged term and topic. Many react to it with fear and frustration. Yet that's precisely why we need to engage it. As peacemakers, we need to see the world the way it is before we can transform it. That includes honestly naming systems of injustice and doing so with an orientation towards healing and repair, what others might call collective liberation, which allows us to transform these systems and leave no one behind in the process. It is the only pathway to true and lasting peace, dignity, security, and freedom for Israelis and Palestinians in equal measure. So thanks for listening. Reach out to us with your questions and comments. Be on the lookout for our Telos Tuesdays brief on the topic, and enjoy the show. Well, we are so excited to be having this conversation today. We have the Israel-Palestine team with us for this conversation. Ellie, where are you checking in from?
I'm checking in from Jerusalem.
And Leanne, this is your first time on the podcast. Welcome. Where are you checking in from?
Thank you. I'm checking in from Tel Aviv.
Awesome. We also have Todd with us this morning. Where are you checking in from?
I'm in Annandale, Virginia. Good morning.
And Sarah.
Checking in from Washington, D.C.
Well, folks, we have an A team here with us this morning for this difficult but important conversation. And we're going to dive right in because we have a lot to cover and not enough time to do it. So, Ellie, let's get started with you from a high level picture. Help us understand what exactly even is apartheid from a legal perspective, from a definitional perspective. Can you break down that term for us?
Yeah, sure. So the term apartheid, as we know, or as most people are familiar with, is originally from South Africa, from the system of ethnic separation that they had there. And apartheid as a word is from Afrikaans, and it means essentially separateness. Since the fall of the apartheid regime in South Africa, it's also become a crime, an international crime in international law, and it has several definitions. But for our purposes, and for example, Human Rights Watch and other organizations define apartheid as a system, and I'm reading here, in which there is A, an intent to maintain domination by one racial group over another, B, a context of systemic oppression by the dominant group over the marginalized group, and C, inhumane acts such as forcible transfer of population, expropriation of landed property, and others.
So originally, this legal term comes out of the context of South Africa, but it was then codified into international law. Now, over the past many years, in some circles and some institutions, many decades, that term is now being applied to the situation in Israel, Palestine, particularly in the occupied territories. Sarah, help us understand why this shift has happened. For many years now, most international organizations, human rights organizations, have been calling the situation using the term military occupation. But now many of them are being led to describe it as apartheid, as defined by international law. What has changed? Why has this movement begun happening?
Yeah, it's a really important question. So, as you said, right, over the past 60 years, how human rights organizations have advocated around this has shifted. That includes Israeli human rights organizations, Palestinian ones, international ones. And I think it's important to note that it still technically is a legal military occupation. There's a whole separate set of laws that govern military occupations. And so historically, human rights organizations have advocated within that framework. But what's changed is that military occupations are meant to be temporary. And the situation in Israel Palestine is no longer temporary. Almost 60 years later, it's a very different reality than when it first came about after 1967. And so I think in the public imagination and the common perception, there's this idea that there are two separate regimes that operate side by side in the Holy Land, separated by the Green Line. One that is Israel, is a permanent democracy governed over Israeli citizens. And the other in the occupied Palestinian territories since 1967 was supposed to be a final status issue that was negotiated to be determined during future negotiations. So that's where this idea of a temporary military occupation came from. But in the 50 to 60 years since, what's happened is that there's really a one state reality, one system of governance that affects everyone, whether they're Israeli or Palestinian, between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. And as time has gone on and as facts on the ground have changed, a lot of human rights organizations believe that the conditions, the way Israelis and Palestinians are subject to Israeli law, to military law, to civilian law, meets those necessary components of apartheid. And so part of why we see, I think, this shift towards using this framework is, as we know, we have to name the world the way it is in order to transform it. And so human rights organizations now, because of the shifting timeline and because of the ways in which the conditions on the ground have transformed and the way that this one regime ends up being more permanent, feel that this is the best framework now to use to advocate for human rights for Israelis and Palestinians, to ensure that everyone's freedom, dignity, security, human rights are being respected.
So that's helpful, Sarah. Thank you for breaking down some of the changes over time to the realities on the ground and how that has shifted the way that international organizations, Israeli and Palestinian human rights organizations, what terms they're using to describe what's going on, because that can be such a helpful and necessary way to find a solution, right? Find the path towards transformation that enables justice and flourishing and peace for all people. But let's break it down a little further into understanding what exactly is happening on the ground that folks are seeing and describing as, one universal system, but with different realities, different experiences for folks on the ground, depending on who you are, depending on your background and your ethnic and national origin.
David, I want to jump in on that because I think there's some important context to add to what Sarah very helpfully did. And that is, there's a way to look at the fact that there are international human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch. There are certainly Palestinian and Israeli human rights organizations that have named this apartheid. And increasingly that is becoming a very normative thing to do in the space of human rights work and also in like progressive activist circles and all that. But I also want to just note that you can go back many years and you have other voices that have been saying this for a long time. So if you go back to 2006, President Jimmy Carter wrote a book called Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. And it was meant to be this cautionary warning, particularly to Israelis and to the international community, that unless real serious effort was done to end occupation and to create a Palestinian state, Israel would end up being an apartheid state. That was 2006. In 2007, there was the Annapolis peace process that the United States sponsored, and the very right-wing Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, who came from Israel to that conference, said, in the aftermath of the conference on his way home. He said, "I'm doing this because we are going to become South Africa unless we, go fully down this road and help create a Palestinian state." And Olmert has been a consistent voice over time on that. Also, Ehud Barak, another former Israeli prime minister, for years has been saying, this is the inevitable place this is all leading. So I just want to say that it's actually not just, like human rights organizations and progressive activists that have been warning about this or talking about this, and certainly not just Palestinians who've been talking about this for a really long time, but it's also, people within Israel itself, left and right, who've been warning about this.
That's such a helpful point, Todd. And we're going to get later on in the conversation to talk about how this reality of, what folks are describing as apartheid not only shapes the lives of Palestinians, but also shapes the lives of Israelis, and how, part of the work that we're doing with this vision of mutual flourishing is that it's about setting everybody free, right? You're talking about these Israeli leaders who want to see their own nation flourish, which, as in our framework, can't happen until all people across the region are flourishing equally with equal measures of security, dignity, and freedom. But Leanne, I want to draw you in now to talk through specifically the way that this fragmentation and this separation happens on an experiential level for Palestinians. Under the occupation, you have different statuses for Palestinians depending on where they live, where they were born. So walk us through that. How does that work between the different statuses under this situation?
Okay, so to begin, it is, I think, important to just point out that Jewish people in Israel, they have an Israeli citizenship, obviously, full citizenship rights, including voting, freedom of movement, obviously, within Israel. They have access to social services, healthcare, education, and economic opportunities. Palestinian Israelis, Palestinian citizens of Israel, they also have Israeli citizenship. They have full rights on paper, including voting and holding public office, but face systemic discrimination and inequalities in various sectors such as employment, housing, and education. Challenges for us in Israel often is about underrepresentation in political and social spheres. Security-related restrictions and mistrust by the state can limit our freedom and opportunities. In the West Bank, Palestinians, they are residents of the West Bank. They are under partial Palestinian authority and control in certain areas, so areas A and B, but Israel maintains overall security control, especially in Area C, which makes up about 60% of the West Bank. They lack Israeli citizenship and voting rights in Israel election, obviously. Limited autonomy under the Palestinian Authority with significant restrictions imposed by Israeli military law. They are subject to Israeli military checkpoints, roadblocks, and the separation barrier, which restricts their movement and access to services. In Gaza, Palestinians are residents of the Gaza Strip. They have been governed by Hamas since 2007, but under a severe blockade by Israel and Egypt. No Israeli citizenship or voting rights, obviously. They suffer from heavy restrictions, high levels of poverty, unemployment, and limited access to basic services such as healthcare, clean water, and electricity due to the blockade, and frequent conflicts. This is all from before October 7th even, so we can only imagine how it is now. In East Jerusalem, Palestinians, they have permanent residency within Israel, but no citizenship. Most have permanent residency status, as I said. They can apply for citizenship, but few are granted that citizenship. They have limited social services compared to Israeli citizens, and can vote in municipal elections, but not in national elections. They face significant discrimination, threat of home demolitions, and difficulties in obtaining building permits. And the residency can be revoked under certain conditions, leading to potential displacement also.
That's such a helpful overview, Leanne, of the experience of Palestinians in their lives and their rights and their access to movement, to housing, to basic social services. strictly depending on where they were born. And yet, as you're naming, there's this other system that exists for Israelis across the region, that they have access to all of those things no matter where they find themselves, right? So that kind of getting to this idea of, apartheid meaning separateness and two different sets of systems depending on where you're from, we're seeing that kind of surface here. I would love to hear from your point of view also how this fragmentation of Palestinian society, how that impacts Palestinian community and sense of identity across the region, both in the occupied territories and within Israel for Palestinian citizens of Israel.
So the impact on Palestinian identity and community in the West Bank and Gaza is profound. Also here, but it takes different shapes, I think, in the West Bank and Gaza. In the West Bank, Palestinians live under a brutal military occupation. Like I said, they face daily hardships like checkpoints, travel restrictions, violence from settlers and soldiers. And this constant state of surveillance and control deeply fragments their community. The occupation is not just a physical barrier, it's also a psychological one that impacts our sense of self and collective identity no matter where we are. This also, I think, creates a deep sense of resilience and resistance, and it becomes a core part of our identity, I think, especially in the West Bank and Gaza, as they constantly struggle against forces that seek to oppress them. I think this applies especially to Gaza, especially since I'm not sure I can speak on the impact it has on their identity over there, especially after October 7th. But I can say that what we have seen come out of Gaza was a true sense of unity and a very unusual, unfamiliar sense of resilience as well. Yeah. So for Palestinians within Israel, so Palestinian citizens of Israel, it's important to state, first of all, that I don't speak for all Palestinians in Israel. And many do not share my beliefs or feelings, but that is also a part of our identity and our reality that needs to be addressed. We are divided, and there is no sense of unity that lies within our identity because our identity in itself is not unified and solid. So we can derive a sense of unity from being Israeli Palestinians or Palestinian Israelis or citizens of Israel as Palestinians. There are so many elements that make us who we are, and so many forks in the way we go, and we don't always end up in the same place. It's hard to arrive at the same conclusions like other Palestinian citizens of Israel, and many times, unless you've reached that same conclusion, you struggle to feel like you're the same people. So for us, the impact on our identity and community is both complex and painful. While we hold Israeli citizenship and have certain rights and privileges, the systemic discrimination in employment, housing, and education is a daily reality, like I said, and it takes a toll on our community's spirit and identity. And I believe that to deal with that, Israel has created a system of comparison for Palestinian citizens of Israel, and it pulls us in different directions according to what is more beneficial in that moment. So, for example, this is a personal example from my life. After October 7th, we were compared to both Jewish people and other Palestinians in the same breath. So someone once told me, you can work and do whatever you want, comparing me to Jewish Israelis. And in the next moment, he told me, we've liberated your minds and now you're free to dress and act as you please, comparing me to other Palestinians and how they are viewed inside of Israel. So to be compared it means that you are different. And that's the case with us. And we are left always suspended in the air and we don't belong to either side. That's how it feels. And that's our reality, unfortunately, inside. Yeah, so our identity lies more in what we've been denied than what we've been granted. Jewish Israelis often don't understand that when we call it apartheid, we refer to the emotional state we find ourselves in rather than just whether we can vote or have social services. Israel has done a good job of painting Palestinians as truly less than human and unworthy of care, that when we express sadness and anger towards what we see happening, it is incomprehensible and thus inexcusable. And this is where the distinctions, I think, come into play is, I think Israel, after it found itself in a place where it had Palestinian people in its borders after 1948, it understood that it needed to create a subtle yet profound distinction, which I think can be found in the term Arabs for us here inside. So if both Jewish and Palestinians had the constant reminder that we are in fact Palestinians, the state would not have been established, I think, especially not in the way it has or it was established. And I think what attests to this is what happened after October 7th inside of Israel. Palestinian Israelis realized that we were the only ones who remembered we were still Palestinians. It felt like the Jewish people had forgotten that we are in fact Palestinians and we're not just random Arabs that found themselves living inside of Israel. And that led to us being reported, fired, and shunned. That was the result of the shock of the Jewish people after October the 7th also. And this discrimination, yeah.
Leanne, that's such a helpful overview of experiences, but also even just your personal life. I'm deeply grateful that you share those experiences with us and name something that's really important in this conversation, which is not just the, systemic discrimination or legal barriers or, lack of opportunities that the system of apartheid establishes, but also the psychological harm. The sense that I am less than or I don't belong here in my own home, that creates deep harm and trauma for massive communities, right? For an entire people. And so there's so many layers to this to unpack. And Ellie, I want to kind of draw in another angle of this, which is the psychological harm of a system of apartheid has on the community or the society that is enacting it, within Israeli society, how it shapes, what kinds of policies or cultures it enables. We talk about violence in so many different forms. We talk about it in the physical form, what we're seeing right now in Gaza with the bombing. This is the punch, it's the rocket, and we talk about it in the structural form, which is, as we're talking about the system of discrimination, of legal barriers, of different road systems, depending on who you are. But we also talk about it in the cultural form, in the stories and the beliefs that justify and enable structural and physical violence. It's cultural violence. Help us understand, the impact of all of this on Israeli society and perhaps where that cultural violence can be found or is formed.
I first want to say, and to echo what Leanne just said, and shared from her experience and just the general overview of the reality of apartheid in this land, is that obviously the main impact and the people who mostly suffer from this are the Palestinians who are living under the system of apartheid. And with that, it is true that the system also impacts internally. If we think about apartheid in South Africa, that was also a dictatorial regime. It was not such a democratic regime. We're seeing within Israeli society a lot of those ideas and a lot of those policies coming in and impacting the lives not just of Palestinians, but also of Israeli Jewish citizens. Whether that's in terms of freedom of speech, whether that's in terms of demonstrations and who's allowed to demonstrate, or things like the nation state law, which have to pass in 2018, which have to create this very loud idea, only Jews have the right to self-determination in this land. Only Hebrew can be a national language, and similar things like that. So I think those are impacts that Israeli Jews feel here on every day. And there's a larger, maybe more subtle impact, which is just kind of the moral reality in which people operate. I see this even more so since October 7th of, what does it mean to carry out policies like this? What does it mean to see yourself as someone who's superior, to believe that you deserve those rights and your neighbors don't? And that's sometimes hard to parse out, and people have different opinions and different ways to understand themselves. But I know from living in this society, those ideas, whether or not we think about them directly, they filter into our everyday lives through anger and violence and different emotions like that. So for me, I think it's everything that Jewish Israelis are doing and the policies that they're creating towards Palestinians, there is a reverberation of all of that back into Israeli society, back into Jewish Israeli society, which harms that society from a moral perspective, from a cultural perspective, and so on.
One way I like to think about violence is that it is this spiral, right? And so wherever it exists, it begets more violence. And that's not just true for physical violence, it's also true for cultural violence, right? And that when we create these stories that someone else across from us, our enemy, is less than me and therefore justifiably, hurt or harmed by me, then it creates this system where that's going to be received back in turn, right? We talk about whatever there's violence under the surface in this kind of cultural or structural way, it will bubble up to the surface. When you have a people who can't breathe because they're under systemic inequality or oppression, it will bubble up into this kind of surface level violence that extends this conflict, what seems to be an intractable conflict to us. And I want to dive a little further into where that exists under the surface. And Sarah, I'd love to bring you in specifically to help us unpack what's happening, particularly in the West Bank, where these two legal systems for Palestinians and one for Israelis is so apparent. You can't avoid it as you're traveling through the area, as you're living in the area. Can you walk us through kind of how those systems operate, where we see them, and then its impact on these communities?
Yeah, so one of the biggest distinctions that contributes to this structural violence of what many call apartheid is the way that Jewish Israelis and Palestinians are subject to different legal systems. So Israelis, regardless of where they live, whether they live within the state of Israel or whether they live in settlements in the West Bank, are subject to the Israeli civil justice system. Palestinian citizens of Israel are also subject to the Israeli civil justice system, one that might look more like our American criminal legal system in the United States. Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza are subject to military courts, Israeli military courts, which deal with everything from simple traffic violations or speeding tickets to permit violations to suspected terrorism offenses. And if you could imagine what it would feel like to get a traffic ticket and have to go to military court, right? That is a gross exaggeration of what needs to be happening for people's daily lives and the impact on them. And there's vastly different impacts of those two different courts. For example, Palestinians who are subject to the military court system can be arbitrarily detained under administrative detention for up to 90 days without access to a lawyer or without access to understanding why they've been detained. Whereas Israelis and Palestinian citizens of Israel who are in civilian court have to be given access to a lawyer within 48 hours. So those are two very different experiences of the legal system. And under administrative detention, Palestinians can be kept for periods of anywhere from 3 to 6 months without charge or trial after being preemptively arrested just for being a suspicious threat to security, right? There doesn't have to be a demonstrated due process kind of case of why they're suspicious. They can be held essentially without cause. And those 3 to 6 month periods are renewable indefinitely. And those two different systems don't just impact adults, right? They impact Israeli and Palestinian children differently as well. So in Israel, right, Israeli children, Jewish Israeli children, Palestinian citizens of Israel's children are subject to civil court, right? They're treated with leniency as children should be. But Palestinian children under the military court in the occupied territories can receive full prison sentences for any offenses from the age of 12. And they're subject to the same military court system in spite of it being incredibly violent and inappropriate to be applying to children. And so part of why these two different court systems contribute to why so many human rights organizations and others name this as apartheid is you have one state, Israel, that has legal jurisdiction over everyone within that territory that are treated to two separate and very unequal systems. And again, Palestinians are under the military court system because it's a military occupation. And while that's okay for temporary measures, right, that's a principle or a practice that applies universally when there's military occupation. The fact that this has gone on so long means that these are systems that permanently govern essentially people's lives in drastically unequal ways that really, contribute to the direct and structural violence that different people face, just depending on who they are.
That's such a helpful breakdown, Sarah. Todd, I want to draw you in specifically to discuss the recent ICJ ruling about the situation in the occupied territories and their determination that, yes, this is a military occupation and it's actually illegal under international law and it represents an apartheid system. Can you help us understand that decision and how it might shift the international community's understanding, response to what's going on?
Well, I'm not an expert on these international systems and international law in the way that someone like Greg is, who is on sabbatical right now, and we miss him, to help us understand these kinds of things. But obviously, this matters in some really important ways. The enforcement mechanisms of these international bodies and courts are pretty limited to enforce their opinions. But there are obligations of member states and those who've become parties to these treaties to actually, carry out the consequences of these kinds of decisions. But I think what it really points to is the way in which, I said earlier something about what an Israeli prime minister had said back in 2007 about if this conflict wasn't solved, the occupation didn't end, Israel was headed toward a South Africa type situation, which what he was saying is that Israel was going to become a pariah state in the international community. That actually does matter over time. I mean, what your standing is and how you're viewed by other countries really does have consequences on so many levels. And I think what this latest ruling is, it just gives voice to what so many nations of the world and what so many people in the world are, how they're actually seeing this reality, how they're seeing the reality for Palestinians, and how they're seeing the state of Israel, and how they're seeing the absence of any effort to not make this occupation permanent. When there was an era in which it seemed to be there was an effort to create a two-state solution, or there was some kind of effort to solve the conflict and end occupation, then these voices were easier to push aside. But when you have an era in which there is no work being done, no commitment being made to ending the occupation. In fact, you had the Israeli Knesset just last week, vote on a resolution to denounce the idea of a Palestinian state ever being created, as if that was somehow being, a legitimate thing being discussed at any point right now anyway. But like that, they took the proactive step to say, no Palestinian state ever. That signals to the international community and to Palestinians, and that this is meant to be permanent. This is meant to be forever like this. And so, if that's really the case, then where else are you going to go in terms of like how you're describing what's going on here, except to those kinds of places? And it completely gives all credence to those arguments, and it makes those people, again, Jimmy Carter and Ehud Olmert back, almost 20 years ago, makes their warnings very prescient of where this all heads in the absence of an honest effort to create Palestinian autonomy or allow Palestinian autonomy to create a two-state solution. Something, again, that's such an antiquated idea at this point to talk about two-state solution, but it was the way to make the occupation not forever, and we are at a place where that's not even being considered, and so this is where we're left.
So, Todd, help us understand, for some communities, the application of this term they find deeply problematic, whether it's about, the historical analogy not being one that you can make because these situations are different, or because it's a problematic term to describe, the situation, it's not applicable, or it's even offensive in some cases. Help us understand the hesitation to apply the term apartheid within these communities, and also what might be our response, or how might we hold in tension some of the things that need to be held in tension here? Is that part of the calling for peacemakers in this moment?
Well, who wants to be called an apartheid state? I mean, who wants to be accused of being guilty of apartheid? There's an obvious reason that Israelis and friends of Israel around the world don't like are hesitant to use that. There's also a way in which it is Israeli human rights organizations and Israelis themselves who are often using that language too. So it's like it's not just. I mean, let's keep that in mind too. But there's obviously a reluctance to apply this historical example of South African apartheid to any other situation, and yet has been created a whole definition, international legal definition of apartheid that Sarah helped us understand in the beginning that does apply in these kind of situations. It's not the exact same historical example, but what you often hear from people who would reject it depends on sort of what you're talking about. Are you talking about the situation in the West Bank? Are you talking about the situation in East Jerusalem or in Gaza? Or are you talking about the situation for Palestinian citizens of Israel? And so it can depend on what you're talking about, because many people who will reject the whole idea of using the language apartheid will be basically talking about what happens inside internationally recognized Israel for Palestinian citizens of Israel who do have, voting rights, as we've talked about, and have other rights and freedoms inside Israel, and serve in the Knesset and on the Supreme Court and so forth. But Leon, also, you helped us understand. You've kind of given us another perspective on what that looks like, even for Palestinian citizens of Israel. But that's often what people are talking about. They're saying there's not an apartheid system within Israel. It's not that is not analogous to what was happening in South Africa, for instance, what's happening inside Israel. That's more second-class citizenship, discrimination in certain ways, like lack of equality, but it's not a system like apartheid really is. But what we're talking about, I think, today is looking at the overarching architecture of the system of everything between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, and looking at what is the sum total of what this is like. And it has different expressions because there are different legal statuses for Palestinians, as we've explained. And I know we have other resources that people can delve into to learn more about what those statuses are. And there are lots of other places you can go to learn for yourself on those issues. But that whole system does create the consistency, is that there's a difference in your rights, privileges, and status based on your ethnic, religious, or national identity. That in itself gets us back to an actual definition of apartheid that has to really be wrestled with. And if people don't want to apply that, they still have to find ways to talk about this reality in ways that are honest to the experience of people who live with those differences, people in Israel, in the West Bank, in Gaza, in East Jerusalem.
Todd, that's such a helpful overview for us. And I think it prompts the question, at least in my perspective, of what do we do with this? Because if we're naming this as apartheid, if we're recognizing these two unequal systems and acknowledging how this will ultimately lead to a reality where no one can flourish in the land, where no one can have dignity, security, and freedom in the way that everyone deserves, then our response as peacemakers should be to work to transform it, right? To enable Palestinians to have the freedom of movement that they deserve, the ability to build homes and live in their communities, and have a national identity and not be fragmented by a system that they have no oversight over, right? And yet for Israelis, also this freedom from this kind of cultural understanding of hierarchy of human belonging and this need to feel like they have to defend themselves at all costs, even at the cost of their neighbors, right? So there's this interest in setting everyone free from the system, which is ultimately harming all people in the region. Sarah, what can we do? What do we do with this information? Why does it matter for us as American peacemakers primarily? How can we respond to invest in a future of mutual flourishing?
We keep advocating. I think part of the use of language like this is to help make that violence visible, the direct cultural structural violence that we know needs to be transformed in order to create the conditions of mutual flourishing for Palestinians and Israelis. And so often right now, especially after October 7th, there's so much focus, as there should be, in ending the direct violence that we're seeing, right? We can't let up our advocacy pressure on that. But also, if there were a ceasefire tomorrow, all of this violence that we've been discussing today that exists kind of below the surface, that contributed to where we are now, but is not how we can let the future continue, that all has to be addressed. And so as we continue to think about how we advocate and how we go out and advocate, all of the different pieces we've named today, whether you want to use the label of apartheid or not, are issues that we need you to advocate around, whether it's freedom of movement, military courts, the treatment of children in military courts, right? All of these different issues are issues of immense violence. And to me, it will always be more important that we work to transform those than that we get caught up in debates over language or what term we should use. Language matters. It's important to accurately identify and name things. But so often I think we get caught up in a discussion over what we should call this versus what are we doing to transform this. And that's what we know we need to do, right? At the end of the day, if we care about the freedom, dignity, security, human rights of Israelis and Palestinians in equal measure, we have to transform the brutal reality of the occupation and the ways that these policies and these practices impact Palestinian and Israeli lives. That's the work we're called to, right? It's not just about discussing this intellectually at a high level. It's about actually naming the realities that we need to transform and getting to work advocating around them.
That is such a good and important word that you just said. I mean, it tells us we have long talked about the need for more light and less heat when we are trying to help Americans better understand this conflict and our role in it. And so we have long avoided what some consider very inflammatory language in favor of more invitational language, while at the same time we have really tried to show people the reality and let them decide for themselves what they think is going on and what the appropriate language is to use. And in the end, that is the most important thing. I mean, language does really, really matter, but also the reality is what matters. And finding the way that we each feel best about the language that we need to use to describe that reality is the most important thing, not the actual term that we use. And at the same time, holding in tension the fact that people who are really being harmed most by this system are using the language of apartheid and asking us to use it too. And so that's kind of where I'm really struggling sometimes to want to be able to communicate this reality in a way that can be understood and heard by people, and yet wanting to also, center the leadership of the people on the margins as one of our core, activities as peacemakers, and listening to that voice and at least making sure that people understand the reality that they are living and experiencing. But something else that you're saying too, I think is really important, and that is the way in which Israelis themselves don't benefit from this reality. So the weight of this is obviously borne by Palestinians, but yet Israelis also don't benefit from this system. And this is where we can learn from Dr. King. And again, these historical analogies are imperfect, and we have to use them carefully. So the system there is not exactly the same thing as we had in the Jim Crow South, but the spirit of Dr. King and the work that he did is very much a way that has shaped our way to think about these things at Telos, the way we do the work of peace and justice in the world. He was trying desperately to end an unjust system of segregation and separation in the United States. But he also knew that what the future that he was trying to create was not this zero-sum future that meant the tables got flipped and that his enemies had to be destroyed. The system had to be destroyed, but the future he was trying to build was one in which his enemies could flourish, because he also had the wisdom to understand that even his white enemies were not thriving under this system, that these false notions of supremacy that were being cultivated in them were corrupting their own souls. And I think Ellie spoke to that earlier, and David and Sarah, y'all have too. But that's also important, that we're doing something that is oriented toward a future in which everybody can better flourish, Palestinians and Israelis alike, but in a truer way, a more honest way, because it's a way that's grounded in their mutuality, in their universal human dignity, and in ways that will truly allow for security, dignity, and freedom for all. So the language we use is important, but that goal and the work that we have to do to get there and the honesty about getting there, we can use different language to do that too. In the end, the use of the term is not just, the word apartheid is here to stay, and it's only going to gain in traction in the absence of any honest effort to try to solve this reality. And it's a whole changing of the system. I think that's the only way to avoid this word and this framing from becoming more and more the way in which the world sees what's going on there.
Ellie or Leanne, any final comments about what you'd want our listeners, Americans, American Christians even, to do right now in response to the conversation we're having?
I think what Todd and Sarah just said is really, really important, and really the direction that we all need to be going in, and to understand it. And I think, our calls to advocate for a ceasefire, for a resolution to the violence that's happening now, is first and foremost. And then, exactly like what Todd just said, we need a resolution that is about the mutual flourishing of everyone in this land. It's about the equality of Palestinians who are currently under this system. And we really need, especially Americans who have such an outsized role and stake in this reality, have to advocate for that. And now with election season coming up, that's another avenue that's really important to pursue. So there's a lot of different ways, and for all of our listeners, all of our community, all people who care about this land, the people in this land, that should be a top priority.
This involves us. We are a part of this, and therefore we have a responsibility to be a part of its transformation, folks. And we have agency, actually, to be a part of its transformation. As we often say, wherever there's implication, there's also opportunity to be a part of the solution. So let's take up that opportunity now. Let's take up that call. Let's own our agency and responsibility, as our principles and practices of peacemaking would invite us into. There's so much to respond to right now, as Ellie mentioned. What's happening in Gaza is as bad as it has ever been. There's significant violence and death still, and we must advocate. And we have to be aware and thinking about what happens the day a ceasefire is reached, because none of this is going away, right? Ultimately, the possibility for flourishing for Israelis and Palestinians doesn't start just with a ceasefire. It has to be a transformation of this system so that all people can flourish in the region. And that's what we're invited into. That's what we're responsible for helping to create, folks. We have a job before us. We want to be a resource for you as you are doing this in your community, as you're talking to your faith leaders, your community leaders, your families, your friends. Please review our recent Tell Us Tuesdays post that's coming out very soon. By the time we're releasing this, it should be out in your inbox. Use that as a resource and engage in your communities, folks. Our futures are intertwined. With that, thanks, team, for being here, for sharing your thoughts, and we'll see you next time.